So I'm going to talk a little bit about my trip. I just came back not too long ago, and also about what we're doing here. One of the things that strikes you, I stay at different places. I come from a small town named Naguabo in the southeast that was hit very hard by the hurricane. But one of the things that strikes you is the differences between those who live in the gated communities, who live in the condos, etc., and the people who still are living with toldos, with the blue tarps that are now shredded, that are leaking. You go to areas like Santurce, and it's areas where you have empty buildings, you have a lot of graffiti, you're beginning to see a lot of gentrification happening with foreigners buying land in Puerto Rico, buying land in Vieques, buying houses cheap. I was at an event where Ismael Guadalupe from Vieques spoke, and one of the things he raised was the concern that the Viequenses, they're beginning to be less and less Viequenses in Vieques, and more foreigners setting up shop in Vieques. The other thing is that the Viequenses are having even more trouble with health care, because the lanchas, the ferries that are supposed to be running from Fajardo to Vieques, are in fact being given priority to tourists to travel to Vieques. And so Viequenses have been left at times having to sleep in the ferry terminal. These are people who come to Ceiba and come to Fajardo to get medical treatment, who sometimes cannot get back to Vieques, wind up staying in the terminal, sleeping in the terminal, because they don't always have family in the Big Island. A service was supposed to have been started, I think, from Ceiba, the Ceiba a Vieques, right? There was going to be another ferry, which is not working for the people of Vieques. And so Maria has become, Maria became the excuse to allow services to deteriorate even more in Puerto Rico. There was already bad services with Vieques. Most Viequenses were being born in Fajardo. And pregnant women with cancer, people with cancer, all had to go have treatment in the large island. It's gotten worse. It's become an excuse to not give services, because then people will leave. And if people leave, like they have been leaving from Puerto Rico, leaving from Vieques, leaving from Culebra, it means that there is more ability for the U.S. government to penetrate Puerto Rico, and for corporations to penetrate, for foreigners to buy land, for foreigners to buy houses. And those are the people that are going to be voting in Puerto Rico. Those are the people that are going to have a political voice in Puerto Rico. Those are the people who are going to be, it's not just the U.S. government and the Congress that are making decisions. Now you're going to have people who are, quote, citizens, who are going to have certain rights, while the people of Puerto Rico are leaving and coming here because there are no services in Puerto Rico. And I saw that. I traveled through different parts of the island with my friends, and you could see areas where there are still no services. The light still leaves all the time. Las luces se van todo el tiempo. Water is still an issue in different towns, and Jocelyn can cover more of that. But these are the things that, after Maria, it's become more and more precarious, the conditions in Puerto Rico for a lot of people, because it was clear that they were not going to get services right after Maria, and they're not getting any services now. The junta, the Fiscal Control Board, is completely in charge of Puerto Rico. The governor of Puerto Rico has no say. He can talk all he wants. I'm going to tell Trump this and that. He has no power. The power lies with the government of the United States. The Financial Control Board responds directly to the Congress. And, of course, the governor of Puerto Rico is trying to accommodate the U.S. corporations that are there, is trying to figure out ways to get investments in Puerto Rico, while still trying to act like he's actually in charge of anything when he's not. He is a pro-statehood governor that really has no power. And so he and the ruling class of Puerto Rico right now, if you can call it a ruling class, are looking to accommodate themselves with the Congress, accommodate themselves especially with private businesses, corporations that are going to Puerto Rico and looking to invest. Part of that investment process has to do with also dismantling Puerto Rico's labor laws, dismantling Puerto Rico's environmental laws, dismantling the social services of Puerto Rico, so that then they can go in there and exploit Puerto Rico much more easily. If you have strong labor laws and strong environmental laws, you have to pay people a decent living wage. You cannot just pollute the environment any way you want, like they're doing with the cenizas, the ashes, toxic ashes. So all of this is setting the conditions for these private corporations to be able to go to Puerto Rico and not have the kinds of restrictions that they might have had at one point with the labor laws and with environmental laws. For us here, for call to action, this is a crisis. We consider what's happening in Puerto Rico a crisis. We consider it genocide. When we look at genocide, we look at the destruction and the destruction of a people, of a nation, its culture, its history, of people that are forced to migrate and come here. And when they come here, where are the social services? There are no social services for the Puerto Ricans that come here. They wind up in hotels. They wind up on welfare. They wind up looking for jobs. They wind up homeless, like we have so many homeless Puerto Ricans now in Florida, who went to Florida thinking, oh, it's tropical, and they offered us jobs. No, you're competing with jobs from people of this country who are unemployed. There is a great deal of unemployment in the United States. And so you have this influx of hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans who are unemployed, who do not always speak English, trying to compete with unemployed workers of this country in industries that are not expanding right now. The areas that are expanding, for example, in this country are the areas that Puerto Ricans are not able to go into. So we're looking at a crisis. We're looking at how do we respond both here to the struggles of Puerto Ricans here, which is different from the struggles that we faced when we were growing up. Right? Because our parents were the ones that came here en masse, for many of us, and we were the ones who were growing up here. Now we have people coming here at a time when we are already, more or less established, quote unquote, but the services are not here for our people, because the services that they're coming to look for have been dismantled here as well. Healthcare is being dismantled in this country. Schools are being closed, with charter schools being opened instead, right? Hospitals are closing. Jobs are scarce. So our people are coming into an economy that is not growing. And in Puerto Rico, the economy is in shambles. So we have to be discussing at this point in call to action, how do we raise consciousness around those struggles that we're going to have to wage here again in this country, but at the same time, how do we support the people of Puerto Rico? We have a movement in Puerto Rico, we have social struggles in Puerto Rico that need to be financed. People are unemployed, and activists are unemployed. It isn't as if the activists have a job and the people don't have a job. The activists are part of the people, so they're unemployed. We have a bunch of teachers that are being laid off, that have been prominent in the struggles for Puerto Rico's educational system. They're being laid off, so they're going to come here. They're not going to stay in Puerto Rico. Their pensions are being threatened. So we have to find ways to support, monetarily, financially support, the movements of Puerto Rico, like Se Acabaron las Promesas, like the Federation of Puerto Rican Teachers, like the agricultural projects that are being developed in Puerto Rico by young agriculturalists. We have to be able to support our people. It is not enough, I was telling people the other day, it is not enough to like a struggle on Facebook. It's not enough to put a little check mark or a little heart. We have to dig into our pockets and say, okay, what can we do? How do we support you over there? What do you need? And we have to be able to then also come to whatever elected officials we believe in and demand from them, harass them the way we did back in the 70s and 80s. We have to be able to do protests in the street in areas where Puerto Ricans are not getting services in this country. So I would hope that this can become a discussion about how can we do that? How do we support those struggles? How do we support the struggle of the people of Puerto Rico? And how do we support the Puerto Rican community in this country? Even as we also support the migrant workers, Latinos like us, who are being abused at the borders, and other poor and working people in this country who are being abused. It is an international crisis of capital that's happening, not just here, but all over the world. People are being displaced all over the world. And it's always the poorest that are being displaced. Women and children living in migrant camps, living in refugee camps. Venezuela is an example of part of that international crisis, and how the US government is positioning itself to make maximum profits along with other international corporations, other governments, make maximum profits in different countries and make inroads into countries that up to now it has had some influence in, but has not had direct control of its resources like it wants to have in Venezuela, with Venezuela's petroleum. So on the one hand, we have to keep in mind that what is happening is part of an international crisis, but we also have to then act locally, respond locally to this crisis as it affects us. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. The people of the United States have an obligation, a duty to fight and help us fight for the independence of Puerto Rico. It is not something, well, I'll think about it. It is a duty, it is an obligation for the people of this country. You cannot have freedom in the United States if you have a colony. We have always said that. If you have a colony, if you have a possession that's being exploited, you're not going to have benefits in this country that are going to be in any way lasting. It's always going to be to the detriment of working people of this country, sooner or later. And it is going to be to the benefit of the ruling class of this country, to continue having a colony over there that it exploits over there, and working people in this country that are exploited and alienated from the working people of Puerto Rico. So that's also part of our work, to raise the consciousness of the people of this country and to show the common struggles that we have between working people of Puerto Rico and working people of this country. Right now, Puerto Rico's minimum wage is $7.15. That can be a precedent that is set for working people in this country. As the economy worsens, then you lower the minimum wage in this country. You have people under 20 who are making less than that, making $4 an hour. You can say the same thing in this country. Oh, we have a crisis. We need to lower the minimum wage of young people in this country. So whatever happens in the colony can have an impact on working people in this country. You set the basis over there to experiment with the economy of Puerto Rico and be able to set that up here as well. And so we need to be able to show working people in this country the common interests that we have in fighting for a better society, in dismantling the economic system that exploits both of us, so that Puerto Rico can be free. But in the process, it will also advance the struggles of the people of this country. I'm going to leave it at that and open it up later on when we have questions and answers. I can be more specific. Thank you.
Brothers and sisters, we're going to do a slight shift, and we're going to introduce our comrade Ben Becker of Answer to talk a little bit about.
Good evening. First, I'd like to just thank the organizers of Pro Libertad for inviting me today. I think that I assume that people here have been following to some degree what's transpired in Venezuela. Obviously, it's a very urgent an ongoing issue, although it has disappeared from the front pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the New York Times and the Washington Post, because it appears for now that their plot has failed, and they do not want to draw attention to that. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, former CIA director, arch reactionary, was caught on tape a few days ago speaking to a group of ruling class interests about how difficult it had been to unite the Venezuelan opposition. For a former CIA director, you'd think he would know to not say things that he doesn't want to be recorded. But it was a moment of truth about how desperate the straits are from the standpoint of the imperialists of affecting the regime change that they presumed, as they always presume, was going to be easy. And as they did in Vietnam, as they have in so many cases in Central America, all over the world, they underestimated the degree of unity and patriotism and support that the people have to endure. And indeed, they are enduring quite a bit. I don't think it's possible to minimize the level of hardship that the Venezuelan people are experiencing. I don't know if people saw the report from Jeffrey Sachs and others from CEPR that estimated 40,000 Venezuelans have died since the imposition of economic sanctions, because of economic sanctions, rather, from 2017 to the present. And that number is expected to go up quite a bit. From 2018 to 2019, 67% of oil revenue. It's supposed to be a 67% decline in oil revenue for the Venezuelan state. And that oil revenue itself constitutes about 90% of the national budget of Venezuela. The resources that are needed for so many vital social services and programs for which the Bolivarian Revolution became internationally known. So what we have is similar to Cuba, a very deliberate strategy of economic strangulation and imposed suffering, collective punishment, so as to try to compel some sort of destabilization, if not an uprising that they hope can affect regime change. And Venezuela has the additional difficulty because the state in Venezuela does not control all the levers of economic control in the country, right? There is capitalist property relations still do prevail in much of Venezuela, that it's not like they can just control all the resources of the country and make sure that everyone will survive through a difficult time, as Cuba was able to in a special period. So the suffering is real, and of course, the way it's presented in the media, though, it has no explanation about the real root causes. Everything is linked to Nicolás Maduro. Everything is linked to socialism. Everything is linked to the government. And I think the case of Puerto Rico is so instructive to give the lie to that presentation, because here it's a very selective presentation of suffering. When it comes to Venezuela, you'll see a picture of a starving child. I don't know if everyone saw the photo from the New York Times. A very deliberate and intentional selection of a photo, which some people have. Well, anyway, that photo was obviously. How many people saw it? How many people saw that photo? Only a few. Well, anyway, it's a photo of a starving child, a very emotional photo that hits you when you see it. But of course, they aren't showing that when it comes to Puerto Rico, and they're not showing that when it comes to Flint, Michigan, and they're not showing that when it comes to the South Bronx. And it's not that it's entirely fabricated, but they're presenting it for a very particular reason, is all I'm saying. And here in Flint or Puerto Rico or the South Bronx, you have people under the jurisdiction of the U.S. imperialist government. And so the very things that they're complaining about for Venezuela, food scarcity, lack of health care, lack of services, they are imposing on their own people, and yet it doesn't call into question the legitimacy of the U.S. government if you were to follow the script of the New York Times and the like. So we should just remember, of course, January 23rd, when Juan Guaido got up and at a protest. Think about all the protests we've been to. Imagine if one of you got up and said, "And now I declare myself president of this country." It's such a ridiculous episode in a long list of ridiculous episodes for the Venezuelan opposition, actually, that date back 20 years. And it would be remembered as just a ridiculous episode, actually, because here is a guy who made this self-proclamation who does not have the support of the people. The people didn't know who he was. He didn't even have the support of other opposition figures when he made that self-proclamation. Some of them walked off stage because they were so surprised he had done that. It would have just been another laughable episode, except, of course, he did so with the complete backing of the U.S. government, the most powerful empire in the world. And so within days, he was being recognized as such by dozens of countries, and then it led to the intensification of sanctions, the complete elimination of all oil sales to the United States, which previously was purchasing 35 to 40% of Venezuelan oil, the sanctioning of other countries that were purchasing Venezuelan oil, the blocking of food and medicine and other imports. So while the political crisis is manufactured and it revolves around an individual who has no social support that would allow him to ever be the president, the impact of that crisis is very real. And we should remember that number of 40,000. I think, and try to help propagate that these sanctions have real human implications. Of course, what's going on in Venezuela is the culmination of a plan since the year before, when the Venezuelan government and the leaders of the opposition were nearing a negotiated settlement. And right before they were about to sign, and people should watch the video of Jorge Ariasa, the foreign minister who spoke at the People's Forum. It's up on their website. He said they were about to sign, and at the last moment they said, we're not going to sign. They walked away. And the Venezuelan government at the time was somewhat perplexed by why the Venezuelan opposition had invested 6 months of negotiations, or more even, and then walked away. And they were going to decide on upcoming elections. They were going to recognize the Constituent Assembly. The National Assembly was perhaps going to be recertified. And there was a whole variety of compromises. But they did not sign because clearly they had gotten the message from their real leader, Mike Pence, and the others in the Trump administration: don't sign with the Venezuelan government. We're going to wait till the next inauguration, and we're going to say because you didn't run for office that the elections are illegitimate. So this has been a carefully orchestrated plan for at least over a year at this point. And of course, it has longer roots going back to the Obama administration's full court press on Latin America. Once U.S. imperialism was freed up from Iraq somewhat, they started to focus on how they could roll back the Bolivarian Revolution and the so-called pink tide in Latin America. They've gone after Honduras, they've gone after Paraguay, they've gone after Brazil, Argentina, using a variety of tactics: soft coups, elections, outright coups, and really they just thought they were going to go for it here and take out what for them is like their holy grail. To go after, to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution and then turn the screws entirely on the Cuban Revolution. And so clearly this is not happening in isolation from that broader historical movement that we're in the middle of right now. I want to just speak a little bit to the efforts around solidarity, because I don't think it would be fair to have to just show one side of the struggle. Because we can always talk about how evil the ruling class and the imperialists are, but there's actually been a heroic level of resistance from Venezuela and from across Latin America that's even being reflected here in the United States. And after years of kind of a level of dormancy or quiet, I think people have started to understand the magnitude and the stakes and of what's happening in Latin America with Trump, Pompeo, and Bolton, who are openly invoking the Monroe Doctrine. And they're openly invoking the Monroe Doctrine while seizing $17 billion in assets from the Venezuelan government. They stole Citgo. They stole it. They just stole a whole oil company. They stole $5 billion, I think it was, $5 billion in gold held in London, just seizing the gold of another country and saying it's not under your control anymore, and giving it over to their hand-picked president. This is not neo-colonialism, this is outright colonialism. This is piracy on an international scale, and I think more people are understanding it because of the brazen, vulgar nature of the Trump administration. I don't know if everyone saw the Embassy Protection Collective, which we were a part of. We were part of a coalition of groups that defended the Venezuelan embassy for over 35 days in Washington, D.C., which again, talk about brazen violation. Here the U.S. government has now seized the embassy, which is sovereign and inviolable land of the Venezuelan government, and given it to, again, the hand-picked representative of the U.S. that the U.S. government has chosen, the ambassador Carlos Vecchio. Carlos Vecchio, who works with Juan Guaido, in what sense is he an ambassador? In what sense is this a real embassy? There's no way you can even renew your passport at that embassy, because the people who are now inside that embassy have no connection to the state bureaucracy or the state administration of Venezuela. It's just a political outpost for the Venezuelan right wing, a new headquarters for them. But by seizing it, they openly violated the Vienna Conventions, and they've set themselves on a very dangerous road, I'd say, with almost unprecedented, where now a country's embassies can be seized and stolen by the government where they are located. Even when the U.S. was at war with countries, open military aggression, bombing each other or bombing the other country, they have not seized an embassy in this way before. So really something new which I think is going to reverberate for many, many years. And I think there will be blowback, and there will be other countries that start seizing U.S. embassies. And, you know, this is a very provocative thing they've done, and we don't know how it will reverberate yet. But the Embassy Protection Collective, I think, in particular, played an important role in awakening anti-war and anti-imperialist sentiment in the United States. Just to recall the history a little bit, a group of activists were invited in by the Venezuelan government, the rightful owners of the embassy, and they started to organize events that went against the U.S. media presentation of Venezuela, holding forums, film showings, cultural events. And then the Trump administration told the Venezuelan staff they had a few days to leave. The Venezuelan staff gave the keys to their guests, as is their right, as is anyone's right. It's their property, their building. And over the next few weeks, the Venezuelan right wing in the United States, which has quite a bit of resources, is linked to the Koch brothers, is linked to the State Department, a series of think tanks, started to protest outside of the embassy. At this point, the U.S. government engineers this sort of siege of the Venezuelan embassy, where they claimed to not be doing exactly what they were doing. So they would say, well, it's not our property, but then over time they start to disallow people from entering the building. That was the first thing. Then they start to allow the Venezuelan right to go all the way up to the doors of the embassy. Then they start to allow them, what they did from the beginning, to blare flashlights in people's eyes, play sirens on bullhorns into their ears. Basically, there was this situation set up where they would try to provoke the anti-imperialists, the progressives, and those inside from doing anything that would allow them to arrest people. And we had to be very creative during those 35 days about how to get food and medicine into those who were inside to break through that siege. People may have seen somebody threw a piece of bread up to a window and were immediately arrested for projecting a missile, or throwing a missile, I think is what they called it. So they said, technically you have the right to go and give them food, but they just, in practice, blocked that right. They would allow the right-wingers to surround, heckle, scream, and it was like being in like if it was like a basketball game where the referee is entirely on one side, and so they're kind of pushing you around, but the moment you push back, then you're under arrest. So it required an extremely high level of discipline, extremely a lot of sort of you had to be able to endure quite a bit of provocation in that situation, because we understood what it was aimed at doing. It was aimed at trying to create an open clash. Our side did take many arrests, but what we did here in New York, for instance, is we organized weekly car caravans to go down there to assist our brothers and sisters who were inside the embassy. Comrade Lucy was one of those stalwarts. Every Saturday, it was getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning to go down and organize these weekly mobilizations. And I think another thing that we can sort of learn from that lesson was that it was based on a united front. It was based on a coalition. It wasn't any one group that was part of it. There was a community of resistance that had formed inside the embassy before it was sealed. And even afterwards, we had to keep to a very tight message about why we were in there, and a very tight message as to what we were hoping to accomplish. And in fact, that coalition had people who had differences on the character of the Bolivarian revolution. That coalition had people who might not see Maduro the same way. Some may even be kind of anti. But they recognized that this was a matter of self-determination. This was a matter of independence. And the provocations of the Trump administration could even lead to war. And so from an anti-war basis and an anti-imperialist basis, we had to hold together. And so that by us all being disciplined about our positions, I am a defender of the Bolivarian Revolution, but in the context of that struggle, holding tight with our discipline to the press, the police, the Secret Service, all these different sort of provocations. Every day brought a new battle, a new legal challenge. We learned a lot, and we built a very practical solidarity. And I think we also helped expose the character of the Venezuelan right by them being the ones who were hurling racist and sexist and anti-gay stuff at the protesters. We got to show who they were. When we got to take pictures of them showing up to their protests in Porsches, and with their designer clothes and designer bags, we helped to sort of draw out the class character of the Venezuelan government. And more than anything, it helped reveal, in my mind, the piracy of the Trump administration. That if they had just seized that embassy very quickly in a sort of pro forma kind of way without resistance, it might not have made the headlines. But because there was a struggle here in the United States, people started to see like, wow, this government is really just going for it, violating international law. It helped turn an aspect of the presentation so that it's not just the benevolent U.S. government coming to, quote unquote, save the Venezuelan people. But here you have a government that is trying to provoke war, seizing buildings, seizing assets. It allowed us an opportunity to speak and educate on all of those issues. Now it's become crystal clear because they've started to sanction even the CLAP program, which is the food distribution program. The Venezuelan government, recognizing how the private food monopolies have been hoarding and otherwise sabotaging food distribution, the Venezuelan government has created its own food distribution program at very low cost so that people do not starve in Venezuela, a fact that many in the United States don't know. And now the U.S. government is starting to sanction the CLAP program, calling it a form of money laundering. This is their presentation. So a few months ago, they were saying they were bringing food assistance, that this was the real, they were motivated by just trying to help people who are hungry, to now 4 months later, they're actually trying to literally stop food from entering the country and stop food from being distributed within the country. So the whole media narrative of imperialism, I think, has major holes in it they had holes in it to begin with, but now many people are aware of it. And so that anti-war sentiment that's been awakened, I think, is strong, and we can continue to build on it. It was there from the very first days, January 24th, 25th, 26th. There were protests around the country. Then on February 23rd, there was a national and international day of action in solidarity with Venezuela. March 16th, 1,500 people marched in Washington, D.C., the largest protest to date around Venezuela, again with a very clear anti-war point of unity. Hands off Venezuela, no coup, no war, no sanctions. That means regardless of one's opinion of the policies of the Venezuelan government, if you agree with that, you need to be in the streets. Now, 1,500 is still very small in a country of 327 million, of course, but this is how movements get started. And so I think we should take that same spirit that Lourdes said about our obligation, our duty, and I think with a great degree of optimism, we should continue to organize, because just as in Iraq, just as in Vietnam, the people of this country do distrust the media. They do hate the Trump administration. That's another thing that we have going for us. And they are openly invoking the Monroe Doctrine. It's not like some crazy conspiracy that this is an imperialist action. So it's really up to us to now find ways to integrate the issue of Venezuela into our organizing, to not allow the foreign policy to be some esoteric extra issue, but how, when we're going into the South Bronx, how when we're going into the communities, do we expose that the same country, the same government that's allowing people to starve and go homeless here would like to impose suffering and hunger on the people of Venezuela, and of course, steal their oil reserves, which are the largest in the world. I think that sort of presentation can be very winning and persuasive in the months ahead. Thank you.
Russia and China. What is their role in Venezuela, and if that is why Maduro doesn't go with full nationalization? and Venezuela?
Well, with respect to the question about Russia and China in Venezuela, I think it's a very important question. It's actually it's a question that needs to be wrestled with in a whole range of questions internationally right now, the role of Russia and China. I don't think it's possible to be an anti-war activist and sort of not have an analysis of these countries at this point. And I think it's well past time to be kind of like systematic and think about how the world is changing on a global scale and what spaces and opportunities as well as challenges that creates for the left. Russia and China have played a very important role from the perspective of defending the Venezuelan revolution. Whether or not they have their own sort of motivations, it's not a question of motivations. And I think that, of course, whenever there's the country with the world's largest oil reserves, you can't say that there's no other motivation. But I do think that there's more important than that is actually the political question that's at stake about whether the U.S. is going to establish in very brazen terms, reestablish the Monroe Doctrine, and whether there's going to be another Libya or another Syria in Latin America. And Russia and China have both really put their foot down in a way that they did not with Libya. If you remember the resolution in front of the UN, Russia and China abstained and allowed the U.S. to get the fig leaf of UN cover to attack Libya. In this case, China has sent a small delegation of troops to Venezuela, which is, I think, maybe the first foreign deployment of Chinese troops to a country where they don't have a base since the Chinese Revolution. So it's not a small thing. It is a small and kind of symbolic force, but I think the symbolism is very clear, which is that we're not going to just allow this to happen. Russia sold military parts and planes to Chavez when the U.S. military cut off Venezuela. The Venezuelan oil sector used parts and machinery from the United States that have also been cut off. So there's a very real practical question of if you're cut off from the main source of machinery, whether it's military, technical, where do you go? Venezuela imports its food, and it has for decades. It imports its medicine, it has for decades. It's really relied on oil sales. So the fact that Russia and China are stepping up with a degree of economic solidarity, as well as some of the infrastructure, and the political support to not allow the U.S. to pass resolutions against the sovereign government of Venezuela has been instrumental in slowing the tide of regime change. And that's why there are actually more countries that continue to recognize Nicolás Maduro compared to Juan Guaido. It's certainly incumbent on all of us to make clear who is the international community. It's not the U.S., Europe, and Australia plus their puppets. That's not the international community. The countries of Africa, still, I think every single one recognizes Nicolás Maduro, the Middle East, Asia. The actual, when you look at the world map, it's not the way that the Washington Post would have you believe that the whole world is turned on Nicolás Maduro.
Just briefly, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the relationship that Venezuela has with Cuba, and how is that changed, and the prognosis for it.
It's a very fundamental relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, and I think they both have played such important roles for one another. Venezuela, really the first country to break that OAS kind of isolation of Cuba in Latin America, which had been imposed by the empire. And when Venezuela was able to, under Chavez, establish that link between the two revolutions, it created this space for really the U.S. to be isolated in Latin America, which of course was what led to the changing of the policy under the Obama administration, that they had gone from isolating Cuba to have been isolated in Latin America. So these two things are interrelated, obviously. Cuba's been fundamental in providing training, doctors, teachers, and so much to Venezuela. Venezuela's helped overcome the blockade of Cuba with its oil and energy resources. And that's why I think for the U.S., for Trump, for Bolton, they're seeing this as a shared policy. Tighten the screws on Cuba and Venezuela and make it very difficult for them to trade with one another. They're trying to sanction all the ships that go between Cuba and Venezuela it's really interesting the way the empire has changed its tactics. They don't need to mobilize the navy to actually stand outside of Venezuela's waters, but just through financial means of sanctioning and fining and punishing the insurance companies, the shipping companies, and so forth, they can effectively lay siege to both countries. The Helms-Burton law, which allows U.S. citizens or others to sue companies that do business in Cuba because they're so-called, it was property that was stolen. They're trying to now introduce things like that for Venezuela so that nobody can do business with Venezuela lest they face the U.S. Financial sanctions. I think for Cuba and Venezuela, you can see Maduro and Chavez before them always spoke very glowingly of the Cuban Revolution. Venezuela was also a big focus of the May Day celebration in Cuba. People were showing their solidarity. So I think the solidarity between the peoples is quite strong, and between the governments is quite strong, but they're trying to sever that economic link between the two of them, and of course blame Cuba for Venezuela's social and economic problems. That's a big part of the anti-communist kind of frenzy that the Trump administration is on, that, Cuba's coming to Venezuela, Cuba's trying to export the revolution. So I think these are really linked topics, obviously, and anyway, I could go on forever.
In terms of Venezuela, I've read that there's these talks going on in Sweden where they're supposed to be trying to bring President Maduro together or his people with the opposition. Could you explain what that's about? I never always truly trust that kind of stuff when I read about it.
You want to take more questions, or should I?
Why don't we?
No, I just want to give him the microphone.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you. We'll take them one at a time for now.
Okay. So the question was about the negotiations. I think they're actually in Norway at the moment. Oh yeah. So right, the Venezuelan opposition, as I mentioned before, is very fractured, and it's always been unable to unite. Not because they really are. I mean, there are political distinctions between them, but they all are united around overthrowing and reversing the gains of the Bolivarian Revolution, reintroducing a sort of neoliberal puppet government that can become the main beneficiaries of Venezuela's oil wealth, which is what they unilaterally controlled for so many decades. There were sections of the Venezuelan opposition that did contest the presidential elections against Maduro when he won. They're making it seem like he won uncontested, and it's not true. There are others who, for instance, have always said we should continue to run in the elections, we can win the elections. And then the group that Juan Guaido is from, Voluntad Popular, and Primero Justicia, the Justice First, Popular Will and Justice First, are the two far-right, really extremist organizations. They're pursuing a path of total confrontation. They're saying there's nothing to negotiate about except the day of Maduro's surrender. So they're actually really not part of the negotiations, but there are many other sections of Venezuelan opposition that I think are seeking to hold new elections that they would participate in and trying to create the conditions for that. Of course, there's a danger in that as well, as we know from the history of Nicaragua, where you create such economic suffering, and then you say, well, now we need to have elections, and have elections under those conditions, which make it very hard for a socialist government to win. I think some, in other words, have that strategy. The Venezuelan government is saying, we of course are open to negotiation, as we always have, open to dialogue and peace. I think it's necessary for them to do that, to say that, and to actually to be part of those negotiations, because it actually helps fragment the opposition. If they were to say no negotiation, it would actually lead to total unity against them to try to overthrow them. However, of course, the Venezuelan government, I think, has the principled stance, and they're saying, we, of course, need a new National Assembly. There hasn't been a National Assembly for a couple years now, but the Venezuelan people already had a Venezuelan presidential election. So there's no need to have a second presidential election. If you decided to not run, that's on you. That's not on us. We've had the same electoral system that you won in the legislative arena. you decided not to run in the presidential one, the next one's happening in a few years, you can run then. So I think that I doubt the negotiations will go very far because there is that sort of irreconcilability. But you never know, and obviously the economic sanctions are very severe, and if there was a way to negotiate a way to sort of relieve some of that, I understand why people would be looking for it. The Trump administration, I think, is also very hostile to the negotiations. And until the U.S. empire really cracks on this question, I think Juan Guaido and the others are going to stand firm because they feel they have the empire behind them.
That's the black flag of the resistance in Puerto Rico.
No se escucha.
Aquí van las necesidades básicas de nuestro pueblo. Y aquí se castiga este movimiento revolucionario que día a día sale.
No me engañan las noticias porque nunca las escucho. La tele te idiotiza, tienen el bolsillo sucio. Dale la espalda a un sistema que es injusto. Dale la espalda a quien no te da la mano. Los asesinos grandes se disfrazan de cristianos. Los asesinos grandes llevan en el pecho un blanco. Hablan bonito y tienen el cuello blanco. Los asesinos grandes no son solo los del barrio. No le hagas caso a lo que dicen los diarios. Dale fuego al chota y al abusador. La calle no perdona al que abuse de un menor. Fuego para el gobierno y la autoridad. Jode con tu habichuela y no con las de los demás. Los sapos y las pones nunca entran en mi reino. Sigo firme y solidario por la lucha del convenio. Soy revolucionario, mi guerrilla en el serio. Canto mi abecedario, rimo sobre mi criterio. En la calle somos frutos, al mismo tiempo genio. Te pasas de la raya y te mandamos para el infierno. Aquí vamos para la playa en los días del infierno. Tira la toalla, modo recorre tu chencho. En el mundo de la droga, las esquinas son los templos. Las almas en la calle son perfectas para eso. Salte de mi isla, socio, salte de mi puerto. Ustedes son los ricos, nosotros nos han muerto. Fuego bajo uso y jugamenteo. Desde Puerto Rico les regalamos un dedo.
¡Coño! ¡Que viva!
Los Federicos son ratones del imperio. Jodieron al piso, también a Filiberto. Matan niños y aquí es como una guerra de inventos. Los sueños del petróleo, Babilonia vende sueños. Tus ricos millonarios se dividen los impuestos. La tierra pasa hambre y ellos se suben los sueldos. Nos siembran el terror, siguen sembrando los miedos. El hambre y la miseria son los frutos de este suelo. En mi generación estamos cosechando ¿qué? Estamos cosechando ¿qué? Estamos cosechando fuego, 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 fuego. Hay un planeta que nos respira profundo. El universo se nos muere en un segundo. Una sonrisa no nos va a cambiar el mundo. Hay que guiar la ruta entera hacia un nuevo rumbo. Música de resistencia. Esto se lo dedico a los que se están aprovechando de nuestra crisis y siembran la riqueza encima de nuestra pobreza. A los que llevan más de 500 años robándonos la tierra.